I'm joined by a man who developed his expertise in banking supervision at the US Federal Reserve and also the UAE Central Bank. Calenti has since acted as lead analyst on emerging market banks at Moody's. These days he's head of bank credit research at Societe Generale, and no doubt he's been trawling through the details of those stress test results. A very busy weekend for you. What was the big takeaway from these stress tests from your point of view?
Well, the big picture is the Nordic banks and most UK banks are okay in these stress tests.
Okay.
A number of smaller peripheral country banks did poorly. But across the Eurozone, really the results are somewhat inconclusive.
Why is that?
Well, because these tests did not stress for what's really taking place in the current environment. There's a no default assumption in here, so there's a constraint in the methodology.
Okay, so that's the main problem with these tests, and that's what they were criticized for before, and it's still a concern now, isn't it? But I guess, you know, the regulators have argued that actually you've got detailed information here revealing the extent of these banks holding their exposure, if you like, to European debt country by country and then broken down by the kinds of loans and securities they hold on their books. That's useful information, right?
Absolutely, that is useful information, but that is like reading one half of the newspaper. What we're missing here is granularity on funding and liquidity risks. And that's what these tests did not stress. And to come to a complete answer here, you need to have even more information.
Okay, so Hank, tell me, what is your frank assessment of the health of Europe's banks right now?
European banks are actually captive to politics at the moment. So whatever happens this week with respect to decisions on Greece are going to have a profound impact on EU banks.
And what are you expecting in terms of those decisions? Because, you know, we've seen a great deal of, we've seen a lack of decision-making, if you like. We have yet another summit coming up this week. And I guess if, you know, we're talking about the banks, if you want to look a little bit further down the line, I guess the broader issue is what sort of measures do you take to backstop the banks? Because a lot of individual countries, especially those weaker Eurozone countries, aren't in a position to support their banks right now if something goes wrong.
That's exactly the point. What we need to see is to get to some sort of closure with respect to what is going to take place with Greece, and then we'll see how the chips fall.
How concerned are you about the level of interconnectedness between Europe's banks?
Europe's banks are very interconnected. We have quite large cross-border operations, and stress in one clearly impacts the others. We're seeing contagion lap at the shores of Italy, and that's impacting Italian banks. So this is something that needs to be addressed.
And how much does that complicate the situation? What are we seeing with the banks right now in terms of certain banks wanting to limit their exposure to banks that are directly, I mean, Italian banks is a good example because so much of that debt is held domestically by Italian financial institutions. Are we seeing signs that other banks are sort of backing away in their dealings with Italian banks?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I'd say that the overall markets are stressed, not really tested on these results. It's difficult to access funding at this point in time with all this uncertainty, and so that's why we need to have some closure so that banks can go back to what they're here for, which is financial intermediation.
What kind of closure are you talking about?
We need to know whether the ECB, what type of solutions will be put forward with respect to Greece. Are bondholders going to be taking haircuts on the debt? Will the Greek banks be able to access liquidity if the ECB is not prepared to accept their instruments, and how the IMF and EU will resolve this?
I mean, this has been going on for a while, hasn't it? I mean, as I said, we have another summit coming up this week. What are your expectations of this summit? Do you think that we will get any more clarity or indeed any more consensus on the way forward? Because it seems that there are a great many obstacles to that, including the fact that, you know, if we do see any sort of debt buyback or indeed a voluntary rollover, all these things still being discussed, still on the table. Ratings agencies have said, hang on a minute, it's going to trigger a selective default, and the ECB is opposed to that.
Well, absolutely. I think I'm keeping my expectations low at the moment, and I think that's what the market is doing. It's being reflected in today's movements, and that's why some sort of finality sooner rather than later would be best.
You mentioned today's movements. We just had a quick look at the share prices of many of the big banks, and I mean, they're all lower at the moment. Is this likely to continue in the coming days, weeks, if you like? You know, many analysts are expecting something of a rebound off the back of these results. Doesn't seem to have happened.
Yeah, the rebound is not here. As I said, I think the results are somewhat inconclusive, and so what we'll need to see is how the funding markets react over the next few days.
Okay, thank you very much. Calenti, Head of Credit, Bank Credit Research, Societe Generale. Good to get your thoughts, your reaction to these stress test results.